following is the first part of The Castle of St. Donats, or The History of Jack Smith by Charles Lucas, originally published in 1798 by the Minerva Press and published in 3 volumes. Reader, if thou art eager to begin this history, thou mayst safely skip over the introduction, which only explains the cause and has nothing to do with the thread of the story. What is a novel? Was a question broached by a poor wight of an author from the table of a modern Lord Chesterfield. A poor author at the table of a modern Lord Chesterfield. Methinks I hear thee say, impossible, absurd. Well, sir, go on. J, the Marquis of, whose taste and munificence are as excellent and diffusive as the very otto of roses themselves, some years ago had made a conspicuous figure in the zenith of administration. The party writers of the day thought proper about this time to abuse his lordship's conduct without mercy, when Mr. Penready, by the recommendation of his bookseller, started up as his champion. Mr. Penready had been lately translating the Grecian and Roman orators. He caught their fire, their enthusiasm and rapture. He wrote, he published, and wonders followed the work. A second and a third edition rapidly succeeded each other. Thousands wrote against him. The swinish multitude, whose voice is fame, equally praised the subject and himself. And his lordship on a sudden found his character retrieved, as it were, from the clouds, at least from his area situation, 4 stories high. The bookseller had originally paid a certain price for the pamphlet, but his lordship soon inquired for his defender, and sent his £100 note, with his desire that he would wait upon him. Mr. Penready, in raptures at his good fortune, first purchased a complete and fresh, if not new, suit of clothes. Complete and fresh, from that ragged thing which before scarcely reached to his loins, to the insignificant piece of string which had tied his shoes. A new bob wig and a large cocked hat completed the man. Thus equipped, Mr. Penready sallied forth to the august mansion of the Marquis, with a small copy of verses in his pocket. In his way through the Strand, an elegant snuff-box and genteel cane were added to his retinue at Exeter Exchange, as auxiliary recommendatories. And having knocked at his lordship's gate and turned upon his toe, he gaily uttered that expressive term which had long been banished from his lips. Oh, damn me! While Mr. Penready sent up his name, he could not fail admiring his whole length in a large mirror of his noble patrons in the anteroom. And as he knowingly clapped his hat under his arm, plucked his wig before, and smote his late purchase upon the ground, he gave a smile that a youthful king newly seated on his throne might have envied. Mr. Penready was not suffered to wait long. The Marquis received him with his accustomed politeness, warmly shook him by the hand, thanked him, and promised him his favour. The author, agreeably astonished at the great kindness shown him, humbly presented his poetry, and his lordship was so well pleased with the verses that after carefully casting his eye over the poet's dress, and being perfectly satisfied with his tout ensemble, he desired the favour of his company to dinner. Mr. Penready thought his patron meant supper, as he had eat his morsel some few hours before. He did not contradict the noble Marquis, but, with proper humility, accepted the offer. After dinner, his lordship purposefully led the subject to literary matters. The pamphlet was mentioned. Mr. Penready, who had learned the art of flattery by frequent attendance on his bookseller, judiciously remarked that he had never before written with any great success, which he attributed to his having generally dealt in fiction. But truth, said he, is so prevailing that a clear statement of the circumstances was all that was necessary to ensure my success. The most fashionable kind of writing next came in debate, and novels were declared to be the reigning taste of the day. This drew from the bard at the bottom of his lordship's table that simple question before stated. What is a novel? All the company at once prepared to answer it, but as the ladies were not yet retired, the gentleman very politely gave place, and the Lady Belvivant, who sat at the right hand of General de Jeune, who sat next to the fair hostess, began, A novel should be a delicate explanation of those tender scenes which a common historian neither understands nor conceives. It should be well stored with Gordian knots, which the hero may at once cut through, but the heroine must nicely unravel. Nay, said a maiden lady, immensely rich, somewhat satirical, and to whom every hymeneal preferment-looking gentleman in the company paid his devoirs. It is not an illustration of true love, distinguished from that base and multifarious species with which the world is so much pestered. Undoubtedly, rejoined the general, who had already passed his 30th year. It is a description of love with its 2 attendants, courage and fidelity, conducting his enrapt votaries in the labyrinths of life to the blissful temple of Hymen. I presume, said Mr. Aquatic quickly, a famous physician who had learnedly elucidated the medicinal properties of the various waters, the various watering places. A novel is an analysis of love, the very essence of honour, and a quantum sufficient of all the common virtues and vices, properly mixed together. Rather, reported an old cynic, a novel is a compilation of forced events confusedly jumbled against each other. 'Tis love run mad, honour stripped naked, and passions dancing the haze together. Virtue, common sense, and propriety turned out of doors. A novel is the last refuge of every blockhead of a scribbler. This the old gentleman uttered with such a strong sarcastic sneer that it occasioned a momentary pause, which a reverend divine, doctor of divinity, and head of a public school, taking the advantage of, with great gravity said, "It is, in truth, my dear sir, a coda scribendi. I never heard of such a thing amongst the ancients as a novel. The Grecians and Romans knew far better. 'Tis a modern invention, formed by the degenerate faculties of the present day, and drawn from the very dregs of the cup of literature." Ancients? Oh, horrid! Then I rejoice I did not live in those wretched days, cried a young lady, whose very pretty face was a full excuse for any want of reflection. A novel, my dear sirs, explains to us what your musty old Homers never once dreamed of. It contains the language of the soul, the secrets of the mind, and the treasures of the heart. The poor author, whose head began to droop under the table, and whose pencil had fallen from his hand, felt himself again revived, and picked up his pencil with renewed spirits, while Major O'Sarvis, a venerable officer, a gentleman of Ireland, and who had risen to his majority entirely by his merit, exclaimed, "Ah, my sweet little angel, you speak a language that would have done the old Grecians and Romans good to have heard ye. By my soul, I believe a novel is the first writing under the sun. It is no burthen to thought, and a general in the field, may draw his lines, form his entrenchments, and read a novel all the while, without having his dear, I think you call them, intellects and ideas confused at all." "Then," replied Mr. Precise, who had always, when he spoke, attempted to say something pretty, though the ladies agreed the best of his endowments was an estate of 10,000 a year, "a novel is like a good sauce that will agree well with any dish. It is the pancreatic juice of letters. It is—" "A novel," cried a punster, breaking the thread of his discourse, may then at once be defined, "the most palatable sort of writing." "If you mean to be the friend of the people," said Mr. Letirant, whose wife had died the week before of a broken heart, "show them the miseries and wretchedness of their situation. Let them no longer fancy that they are free and happy, but boldly attack their laws, religion, and government, and—" Here he was interrupted by a very young cornet at his lordship's right hand. "Prove to them by the example of the French disciples of freedom how good a thing it is to want those ties. There no shackles confine the mind for life. Titles, honours, and connections there unknown, nor need the marriage tie anxiously wait for death to dissolve it. Then may your novel, sir, rank among that illustrious sort, which modern ingenuity has fabricated, and taken such pains to circulate round the country." The warmth of the young hero, who had just left Westminster School, finished Monsieur le Tirant's description of a novel, and the noble hostess herself, to put a stop to any altercation, next gave her opinion. "A novel, I think, should be a faithful delineation of those minuter events in the world which the grandeur of the lofty historian disdains to notice. It should be a clear, simple history of individuals in common life, where domestic intercourse and natural occurrences show the characters. The virtues and vices of human nature should be portrayed, and the excellency of the one and the destructive tendency of the other clearly exemplified. The writer," continued her noble husband, "should, like Ulysses, be a man who well knows the manners, customs, and habits of mankind, and particularly of those he means to describe. I took up a novel the other day at my bookseller's, unknowing of the author, and opened it in a page where the writer attempted to draw the behaviour of a set of young men at the University of Oxford. It is not so many years since I left college, as to be ignorant of scenes of that kind. And how was I astonished! I read page after page, but in vain I sought for the place or manners I so well knew. I am ignorant, said I to the bookseller, who your author may be, but this I will venture to say, he has neither had the education of a gentleman, nor been accustomed to the company he describes. I since found I was right. The book was written by the well-known Thomas Blackman, more famous for his translations, for I understand he is a wonderful linguist, than for any publications of his own he has ever yet offered to literary notice. I recommend it therefore to you, Mr. Penready, and to all other writers intending to favour the world with novels, to be thoroughly acquainted with those scenes you propose to draw. Alas, my lord, replied the poor author, my principal scenes, then, must be in a garret. Your style, sir, said the punster, who was determined not to miss the opportunity, will nevertheless be lofty. You'll soar above all common things with sentiments far superior to the trash of this earth. Your manner will, of course, be airy, light, and pleasant, and though you may be sometimes in the clouds, you will undoubtedly excel in the sublime. The cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, will all be familiar to you. My dear gentleman, cried a middle-aged lady, whose affected gravity faintly hid an arch smile, how you scare the poor man. Don't be so easily alarmed, Mr. What's-your-name. Let your heroes be brave, let your damsels be sentimental. Let us have 2 or 3 desperate villains, a wicked old woman, a cunning valet, faithful maid, and pretty little dog. Whether you're a member of Parliament or a Democrat, a parson or a freethinker, you may work out as pretty a novel as any young lady would wish to read. Pray, my good sir, for whom do you write? Not for the grave old dons. They won't read your book if ever so true. But you write, to be sure, for the young gentlemen and ladies who frequent the circulating libraries and have nothing else to do. And trust me, they'll find no great relish for your plain homespun truths. Damn me, ma'am, cried a hopeful young gentleman to whom my lord was guardian, and who heard every word the last lady had said in a serious light. Damn me, ma'am, it's just the thing. I like your bold, dashing, and comprehensible heroes, and have read about many a one with pleasure in those books of my lord's in the powdering room. What? The Arabian Nights entertainments? I thought, sir, you never read it all. Rot it, ma'am. This cursed cropping has been a devilish bad thing to me. I used to read every morning before for a full hour while my valet was combing my hair. But now, somehow or other, I have not the opportunity. The latter part of this speech was spoken in so serious and rueful a tone that the company laughed outright. Indeed, sir, said the punter, this cropping will spoil the head of many a fine young gentleman. The author, who was afraid the conversation would be turned from his favourite topic, and who was eagerly taking notes in shorthand of everyone's opinion, asked a smart little lady who had played nicely on the pianoforte, had a pretty taste for drawing, and was well read in the writings of the romance and novel kind, what was her opinion. She had listened with the utmost attention to the whole discourse, not regarding the querist, but turning to the noble host, she said, My dear lord, I must say I agree with Mrs. Sarcasm and Mr. Puppy. I really see no use in drawing those scenes which everybody knows. Let the writer, if he will copy nature, copy her in the majestic scenes of the Alps and Pyrenees. Let him enliven his work with a few elegant songs. Let him paint in lively colours the pastoral life, the life of happiness. There let his heroine wander amid the bleating of the harmless lambs and the tinkling of the distant sheep bells, while the shepherd plays on his flute, and the innocent shepherdess sings by his side. And around let the nightingale, the lark, and the airy songsters of the grove tune their melody. Then let the hero at last find his faithful mistress in the midst of all this happiness, and let them renew the golden age, their elegant mansion in the country. At this speech, which was spoken in a light and mincing way, the greater part of the company bit their lips. But Sir William Wanton, who had been for a few years before separated from his wife, and which the ill-natured world most cruelly said was his own fault, drew their attention. If you wish for readers, sir, write the language of nature, give her a true garb and colouring, describe the more animating scenes of life, rouse our feeling. Do not let a false modesty hide the charms of your heroine in obscurity. Remember, beauty consists not alone in the face, the snowy bosom, the rising breasts, the tout ensemble should fire the hero and the reader. Let your scenes be soft, be tender, be amorous, be natural. The more critical the danger, the greater is the virtue of your heroine. The more temptations that assail your hero, the more glorious his victory. Even the chaste dictates of a Cumberland have his amorous Jemimas, his Susans, and his Fannies, in no concise terms or frigid language. Throw away, then, the flimsy veil of affected delicacy. Bring sportive Venus and the waggish god of love shaking his bright torch. Sir William means, said a plain country gentleman who had a charming young daughter at the table, and who feared to what lengths the baronet's description might extend, that you should give him a little bawdy to raise his passions. But let me tell you, sir, that the man who wants to see more than a pretty face might as well be taken without them entirely. And the woman who constantly shows those charms all lovely modesty thinks proper to conceal is as much a strumpet in her mind as any mistress Sir William ever had in his life. A gentleman of the University of Cambridge, by whose mathematical skill their scientific seminary had been oft times enlightened, philosophically remarked that properties different from each other could never be the same properties. Such, continued he, are nature and a novel. Nature is a continuation of a known quality inherent in a thing. Novel, a priori, longa remota, is unknown and new, as the name itself exemplifies. Therefore, every novel must be unnatural. This correct and conclusive argument had nearly stopped all further investigation of the subject, but for the ready help of the punster. By the same rule, I presume, my learned sir, new bread then has an unknown quality, and is equally unnatural. Then turning to Mr. Penready, but, however natural, sir, you may choose to be yourself. Take care you don't treat your readers like naturals. One thing only, Mr. Penready, said a widow lady who knew the world, I must insist on, that your females do not make love first, for even if you write with the pen of a Cumberland, you will disgust your male and highly offend your female readers. As for pecuniary concerns, said a dry old gentleman who well knew the value of money, give them not the thought. 'Tis beneath the notice of a novelist historian. The last page is sufficient for such trifles. By killing an old uncle, or at least a 20th cousin, you may make your lovers as rich as you please. But be sure to let your heroes and heroines be generous. If the fair distressed has but 2 pieces in her pocket, she must give 1 to the first impudent beggar that asks her. And your hero must undoubtedly give both. Money, it is true, may be very well with matrimony, but it has nothing to do with love. Venus flies from the cold touch of Plutus. Honours and titles you may do as you will with them. There are the gems which a skilful writer would employ to the very best advantage. Marriage, the coup de grace, is only to be considered as to your hero and heroine, but for the rest of the character, never give it a thought. In your finishing chapter or letter, you may couple them together just as you please, or let your bookseller do it for you. The pretty little daughter of the country gentleman was pressed to give her opinion. After a little demur, the young lady was lately entered into her teens, and the native veil of modesty had not yet given place to one of art. She said, Pray, sir, don't let your hero be too old, and do let him be good-natured, not finding fault with everything his mistress does. I'm sure I should not like such a man, teasing my soul out about nothing, and she was going on without thought, but quickly recollecting herself, with a blush concluded, If you mean to make them happy, let them be married early. The company unanimously joined in applauding her opinion, and his lordship was about to turn the conversation when the poor bard, with many apologies, begged the favour of the company to recommend him those books they each of them held in the highest estimation, that he might study their style, their manner, and their sentiments. Well, sir, said his patron, I dare to say that there is not one of my friends that will refuse you this favour, and I will begin. If you wish to copy real life, study Smollett and Fielding. For neat and pointed satire, Gulliver's Travels, and as a model for your language, take Swift before all others. If you want just reasoning, said my lady, and clear explanation, read Richardson. For nature and simplicity, Goldsmith. For correct and nervous style, as well as for the well-drawn horrors and true pathos, the modern Mrs. Radcliffe will amply furnish you. And for character, Mark Gilbas. I recommend to you, said Lady Belvivant, the incomparable writings of the immortal Rousseau. For sentiment, and those excellent translations from the French, if you do not read the originals, will furnish you with a sufficient number of tender scenes, double ententes, and teach you the passions of the soul. For the forming and unravelling of difficulties, the German novels are undoubtedly masterpieces. You're not for ghosts and hobgoblins, said the widow lady. To describe those wondrous days of yore, the old English baron and the castle of Otranto are most worth your notice. In these, no private history is insulted, no public falsified and confused. If you wish for a hero, said the general, read Gonsalvo de Cordova. Heroines lovely, chaste, beautiful, and enterprising. I'm certain you can find enough among our English authoresses. Cecilia, Evelina, the Welsh heiress, some of the writings of Mrs. Smith are models for you. To find a true soldier in a novel, said Major O'Savis. I believe I must have recourse to some other book. but as I don't know much about books, I'll give you a few living characters and you may study them. B, P, A, C, F, D, Y, S, A, W, ending in C, C, D, ending in C, ending in W, ending in S, 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 and my grave countryman, O'Hara. The recommendations began to follow one another so quick that the busy author had no time to remark half that were mentioned, much less to notice each speaker. Do you want ease and native satire? There's Mrs. Inchbald. For chaste language and sentiment, Miss Burney is unrivalled. For clear knowledge and excellent descriptions of the human heart, who is superior to Dr. Moore? For a pleasing picture of youth, the true pathetic, the fool of quality, has not yet been excelled. For love of virtue and development of the passions of the mind, Mrs. Ratcliffe and Mrs. Inchbald. Nor must Ned Evans, the farmer of Inglewood Forest, the Countess of Castle Howell, the children of the Abbey, etc., 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 be forgotten. You have been told, my good sir, said Mrs. Sargent, that nothing will help your book off so well as a little of the style which the excellent Martinus Scribbler has called the prurient. Let the respectable credit gained by writers who have purchased their fame by scenes of that kind inspire you. Of ancient authors you will find enough from the famous Boccace to the chaste days of Charles II. The very modern ones, Cumberland's Henry and the Monk of Matthew Gregory Lewis, Esquire, M.P., are non-pareils. Yes, said the country gentleman, who was also an M.P. Now is your time to rival the Clelands and Woolstons. Our ingenious, original, and modest legislator seems to have been already forsaken by his diabolical agents. The charm is now broke. The mystic power of M.P. is passed by. Take my word for it, sir. You nor any other writer will have cause to fear a rival from the inimitable abilities of Mr. Matthew Gregory. Here there is a footnote. That a young man should write a bawdy book is no mighty wonder, nor that a depraved and vitiated youth should condemn and satirize religion, but that any man, under the sanction of M.P. to his name, should in the first literary work break through the bounds of decency and holiness, indulging himself without scruple in every advantage the most trifling writer would require, use the agency of witches, conjurers, ghosts, and demons, borrow without discrimination from all authors sacred and profane, confound the mythology of the ancients and the moderns, debasing their ideas and destroying their allegories, and finally disregard every rule of propriety, probability, and even possibility, not only in the machinery of the work, but even in the simple narrative. Such, for instance, is the ignorant stuff of a man flying for his life and carrying before him on a single horse for many miles a large, fat, unwieldy woman asleep. And to all this affix his name as an M.P. is indeed a matter of no little amazement. Yet what will posterity think of the power of a name, when the same kind of trash, aided by an excellent display of scenery, by the grimace and pantomimic exertions of the performance, with almost every idea borrowed, stamps an author's name as a dramatic writer? While I'm on the subject, I cannot refuse mentioning a few remarks among the many which have casually struck my attention. As for the plot, there is none. So far the merit is all Mr. Lewis's own. The story is partly and very widely taken from the Italian Monk. Composition is far superior to Mr. Lewis's as light from darkness. In characters we have a Father Paul, an old Abigail, a wicked lord, and a wicked friend, a poor fool, a poor lover, and a poor young lady, with poor papa, and so forth. For tricks and scenery we have trapdoors, gloomy dungeons, long vaults, daggers, poison, a real ghost in white, and a sham ghost in armour, soldiers, back slaves, etc., etc., etc. I've only time to speak of a few of the best scenes. The trumpery fluff of the friars sticking in the doorway, rolling out of bed, Mrs. Abigail's long and tiresome repetition of the same, imitative of Falstaff's famous lie, is too bad for criticism. The grand scene is where the real ghost first appears. In this, as not a word is spoken by the parties, though much merit may be due to Mrs. Powell and Mrs. Jordan and the solemn music, none can fall upon the sapient writer. The next is where the black slaves play at dice for the prisoner's money, while he escapes from the window. The young Modesty confesses he has borrowed, but the trick of the hero's throwing himself dexterously on the sofa is only worthy a place in pantomime. The scene in which the heroine discovers her father is perhaps the best, as it gives such great scope to the abilities of Mrs. Jordan, yet it is all anticipated and tediously lengthened. The concluding is such a medley of continuation, that whether it is the spectre or the young lady, the old man or his own conscience that kills the wicked lord, or whether he is killed at all, still remains a matter of doubt to the audience. Now for the sentiments. Mr. L. gives himself great credit for the original one of his favourite Black, that since white men have destroyed his freedom and happiness, he takes pleasure in being the instrument of vengeance against each other. This is meanly borrowed from the tragedy of Barnwell, which Millwood, I speak without reference, gives the same reason for her hatred to men, that since men have seduced her, she will do every injury in her power to the whole sex. In the scene where the tyrant, like a second Richard, is awakened by an horrible dream, Barrymore undoubtedly does it every credit till the speaking commences. Then the old story of spectres, skeletons, raw heads, and bloody bones is but a poor imitation of Clarence's dream, exclusive of the different motives for telling it which actuated Clarence and this other wight. But enough of this servile trash. The footnote ends. Come, said the old cynic with a sneer, I'll give you a romance that will do you most good to study, Baron Munchausen, and if you read him, you'll know all the rest of the trash. Mr. Penready looked very glum, but his friend, the young beauty, quickly relieved him. Indeed, Mr. Grumble, said she carelessly, you're much mistaken. There's ne'er a misanthropist in the whole book. What a wonderful fine character you'd make. Observe him well, Mr. Penready. Pray, my dear Mr. Grumble, do you ever have the gout? Whenever a pretty woman attempts a joke, it must of course be a good one, and the company did not refrain their laughter. The cynic made no reply, but tacitly seemed to agree in the general opinion. The beauties may say what they will with impunity. The author now addressed a short, thin, long-fizzed elderly gentleman who had not opened his lips upon the subject, and humbly asked his opinion. Young man, he answered with the utmost gravity, call upon me tomorrow at 12. Mr. Penready made a low bow as he took his card across the table. The rest of the guests smiled. A silence ensued for a few seconds, and the conversation took a general turn. On the following morning, the author failed not to wait on his new acquaintance. He was shown into a large room by an ancient female who might with credit have sat for the portrait of the Witch of Endor. The only window in the room pointed to the south, and as the sun shone full upon it, was covered with green silk blind, which threw a deep and gloomy shade around. The old gentleman, with a white nightcap on his head and in a loose silk gown, sat near the fire, covered with various kinds of pots from which no weak odours scented the air. 2 skeletons of the human species were stationed near the chimney. The tables, chairs, shelves, and even the floor were loaded with books, cups, bottles, bones, pieces of glass, differing in colour, size, and shape, all mingled together in a most happy confusion. The owner of all these good things was, at the entrance of Mr. Penready, narrowly examining a human skull through his spectacles. The moment he perceived the visitor, he desired him not to move, lest he should derange his regular medley of good things. Mr. Penready, astonished at everything he saw, stood like a poor ghost charmed with the circle. The old man opened a drawer in the table, and took out a bundle of papers tightly tied together. Here, sir, said he, are some papers which by accident came into my hands. They seem to have a claim to the nomination of a novel, if truth is no prevention. You despaired yourself of writing one. Perhaps these may answer your purpose. Write them out fair, correct the errors, improve, if you choose, the style, but on no account alter, change, or leave out the most trifling circumstance, nor must you add to them. That I may be satisfied. Let me see each sheet before it goes to the press. But if on perusal you think them not worth the trouble of transcribing and painting, you will return them immediately. I am too busy to ask you to sit down. Good morning to you. So saying, the old woman who stood without opened the door, and Mr. Penready, with the papers in his hand, trotted down the stairs. When the happy author arrived at home, he eagerly examined his new present. It was so badly written, he almost despaired of making it out. He tried patiently a whole hour, then tying the papers up, he determined to compose a novel of his own. On the instant he set to work, and laboured very hard for a week, and at the end of it he was become quite dissatisfied and tired of his performance. Even his self-love was disgusted and sick of it, and his eager desire of being a novelist was completely worn out. In the midst of a most critical yawn, a servant of his former patron brought him a more than polite note containing the appointment to a place of 200 a year. His sudden joy burst all bounds. His purse, rich with an old dollar, and glittering with 6 new pence, flew towards the messenger. He sprung upon his legs and strutted around the room like a madman. Farewell, Sicilian dames, farewell, O beardless paean. Thy 9 daughters, O Arithmetica, goddess of numbers, shall inspire me. And thou, O heaven-spun Marquis, erith me magnus Apollo. And let politics be the order of the day, throw novels to the dogs. Instantly he seized upon the various papers before him and exhilarated his fire with the brain-spun sacrifice. He just opened his desk and the following memoirs had suffered the fate of his own writings, when I was, happily I hope, disturbed from a profound reverie in which I was composing an excellent speech for the new Emperor of Russia. Alarmed at the uproar, I hastily ran downstairs to Mr. Penready's room, and being quickly made acquainted with his great good luck, came just in time to rescue them. "My dear fellow," cried he, "thy fortune is not yet made, and if the mania of authorship is still equal to thy poverty, take these papers, revise, correct, and amend them, and I'll introduce thee to the old gentleman." In short, reader, with the consent of the parties, and with the aid of the notes of my friend Aminadab Penready, Esquire, I have in some degree succeeded, and after hard working for the space of 6 months, produced them in the present form to the public. I was at first not at all satisfied with the style, which I attempted to improve with some Johnsonian lubrications, but I soon was necessitated to give up the task, as I found it only gained a more motley appearance. With great labour I have made out the whole, except the 6th chapter of the 2nd volume, and another which, in defiance of the old gentleman's injunctions, I insisted upon totally erasing, as it reflected very grossly on my, I hope, kind friends the reviewers. The place of the omission of that chapter, as well as the division of another to make the original number 48 complete, I have no doubt will be at once perceived by them, for all men and things they know, themselves unknown. Before I conclude this introduction, I might say a wonderful deal concerning these papers, being evidently copied from nature, but the authors in general who have attempted to make nature an excuse for simple dullness, strange incongruities, and ungrammatical idioms, at once frighten me from that apology. If in the course of perusing them any part should strike the reader as being superior in style and manner, I must humbly beg they will attribute them to my alterations. But if, on the contrary, there should be anything harsh or lame, I desire the whole blame may be laid upon the shoulders of my worthy friend, the old gentleman, as well as any errors, faults, or deficiencies in language, metaphors, or sentiment. There are many other remarks which it might be necessary for me to make concerning names and facts of an historical kind, and which of course must impress themselves upon the notice of the reader. But after a thorough investigation of these subjects, fully observing that maxim of Horace again and again to review your work, I must leave them as I found them, and perhaps the more mature judgment, personal knowledge, or political investigation of others may satisfactorily explain them. I shall only observe that from the date of these papers I was at first led to expect the occurrences of the 17th century, but when I perceived the strong and glaring reflections to the casualties which the 18th had produced, I supposed it to be a mistake of the original writer, and I have accordingly altered it. Yet when I proceeded further, I got beyond the present period. I became totally lost, nor know I how to account to the reader, unless he will agree with me, that the furore of prophesying has at least reached to the novelists of the day. This he must allow, that the above circumstance gives the history an undoubted right to the term novel. C.L. Preface. Anxious of pleasing my readers with the title to each chapter somewhat explanatory, without discovering the whole, perhaps not unlike the figures which are hung out before a puppet show, and which are very often superior to the exhibition itself, I consulted 3 very particular friends. The first, a lady, preferred a bit of poetry. The second, a merchant of respectability, a simple notice in the manner of Cecilia Camilla and other novels. The third, a very learned gentleman, a D.D. of Oxford, was avowedly of opinion that by copying the example of the Spectator and favouring my readers with a Greek or Latin motto, I should wonderfully increase my sale. I determined at last to take all 3, but my bookseller absolutely refused to have anything to do with Latin or Greek in a novel, and declared it would frighten away all the female, at least 9/10, of my readers. Accordingly, I have given over all thoughts of that kind, and now, on mature deliberation, present them with plain English alone. Chapter 1. Epigraph. There was an ancient sage philosopher that had read Alexander Ross over, and swore the world, as he could prove, was made of fighting and of love. Just so romances are, for what else is in them all but love and battles? For the first of these we've no great matter to treat of, but a world of the latter. Hudibras. 2. It was in the month of August 17, when Captain Grey, a gentleman of a small independent fortune in the country of Wiltshire, went to a fair in those parts to purchase a strong, useful horse to take with him to the army. Captain Grey had served under R.H.D.Y. in the campaign of 17, and had behaved with great gallantry and spirit, till a long fit of sickness made it absolutely necessary for him to return to England for the recovery of his health. The cold damps of hate had seized upon his limbs and confined him many weeks to his bed, and a malignant fever attacking him at the same time, it was long doubtful whether he would live to see, and still longer before he could return to his native country. But once returned, the genial influence of his accustomed air soon braced his limbs and restored his fibres to their proper tone, and his usual flow of spirits welcomed the friendly change. At the time of his departure from H, all his military stud had been disposed of to his brother officers, and the melancholy evacuation which quickly after took place fell into the hands of an enemy. In the following spring the regiment returned home, and was now ordered, sick being drafted, new recruits added, etc., to prepare for an unknown expedition. Captain Grey was at this time in his 30th year, in his person tall, handsome, and manly, in his manners and address easy and affable, in his temper free and generous, and his mind, which was better stored with modern knowledge than ancient learning, was neither troubled with too much care, nor burthened with too much thought. His disposition was amorous, not of that base, lustful kind that prowls about for the gratification of a moment, but with a heart open to every impression of female beauty, nor callous even to the most ordinary. As Hudibras boasted to his mistress, so was he to the fair sex in general, true as the dial to the sun, although it is not shone upon. But of the latter he had no cause to complain, for rarely did he meet with so cloudy a face as had not a bright look in reserve for him. Yet with all his love for the fair, neither mean jealousy disturbed his soul, nor private broils harassed his days. No, so totally different from his nature was every species of quarrelling, that in the petty disputes and pointed affronts which the most peaceable are liable to from the drunken testy or foolish, he generally left his revenge to be measured by the opinion of the company present, or some friend of known honour. "What the devil," said a general officer to him once as he passed by him before an engagement, "could induce you, Grey, to choose the army? You're too good for us." "Every female cousin I have in the world, my lord," replied the captain, "plagued my heart out till I had a red coat on my back. It's a very pleasant thing, my lord, among the ladies." "If," said his lordship, as he walked on to some military coxcombs who followed laughing, "he affects not to be a John of Gaunt, Hal is no coward." Henry was the captain's Christian name, and his lordship, whose reading had been in his youth, was not very correct in his quotations, if a little alteration suited his purpose, and never was his lordship nearer the mark than in this instance, for if there was a thing on the face of the earth that Captain Grey despised, it was the affectation of heroism. Such were the outlines of his character. Captain Grey, on entering the fair, immediately went to the part where the horses were exhibiting, and soon recognising a charger which had formerly belonged to an English officer, he quickly settled the purchase money. He had come to the fair alone, and was looking about for some farmer of his neighbourhood, which was but 6 miles distant, to recommend him a boy to take his new purchase home, when a violent uproar in the midst of the fair suddenly claimed his attention. Like a true Englishman, he flew at once to the spot, and the sounds of "A pickpocket! A pickpocket! Duck him! Duck him!" left him not long to doubt the occasion of the assembly, and their present intentions. As they dragged the meagre lad toward the pond which led the way Captain Grey came, he soon found himself closest to the principals, but so many were ambitious of being chiefs in the punishment, and scuffling each to seize on the victim, who, little as he was, fought his best to get away, that they threw him down just before the captain. The boy looked up, and seeing a face where humanity always shone, cried in the most piteous accents, Indeed, sir, I'm innocent." "Whose pocket? Who saw him?" said the captain, struck with his sudden appeal. "I saw him," answered a fellow in ruffles. "Damn me, I suppose you're one of them." This latter part of the speech was intended as a closer to all inquiries. The captain's blood mounted in his cheeks. He looked around him for someone to clear him from the imputation, regardless of the accuser, and at the instant caught the eye of a well-known farmer of his acquaintance. "You, Farmer Thompson," cried he in his loudest tone, "you know me well, and you," turning round to the other, who went instantly changing his note, "seize that fellow, seize him and search him. I remember his face." The mob, who almost all knew Farmer Thompson, instantly obeyed, and emptied the accuser's pockets, when 5 handkerchiefs of different sorts, 2 silver watches, and a purse were produced, and the greater part soon claimed by the company. In the meantime the boy had raised himself on his legs, and as this was the only pretended witness to his crime, was no longer assaulted by the company. All their rage was turned towards the ruffed gentleman, who the captain recognised as being drummed out of his regiment for thieving and cheating. This fellow made one of a party that kept an E.O. table in the fair, but as that was in no vogue till towards the evening, and not choosing to idle away his morning, he amused himself with any petty fests that came in his way. Great success had attended his undertakings, when in the act of removing a large pocket-book he found it was discovered. With sudden presence of mind, he instantly dropped the book, and as readily swore to the party that he had caught a poor ragged-looking boy in the fact, who unluckily was standing by, and but for the interference of Captain Grey had innocently suffered. Now the tables were turning fast. The mob quickly hurried the villain to the pond, nor dared any of his party, who silently followed, say a word in his favour. He was completely ducked, and then horsewhipped out of the fair. The captain, having saved the innocent, no longer troubled himself about the guilty, but going up to the farmer who he had before hailed, asked him if he knew anyone to take care of his new horse. "If your honour will let me lead him, I'll go to the world's end for ye," said a voice which he found to be the boy which he had just rescued, and whole little heart, overflowing with gratitude, kept him by the side of his benefactor. "Why, where do you live?" said the captain. "At Pilford, sir," replied the lad, naming a place 10 miles off and directly contrary to the captain's residence. "Ah, that won't do. It's not in my way. I'm a poor fatherless boy, sir. Got ne'er a friend in the world, sir, but you. I don't care where I go." "No, my house is too far from your village, but here is a shilling for you." "Thank you, sir, again and again, sir. But where's the horse, sir?" The captain smiled. The poor boy, who could not suppose such a gift was given him for nothing, he was unwilling again to say nay to. "I did not give it to you," said he, "to take the horse for me. But can you ride?" "Oh, yes, sir. I ride all for my sulky's horses to water." "What, is he your master?" "No, sir. I've no master. I do it for the carter." "Why, how came you to the fair?" "Well, farmer gave me threepence to drive his pigs. Sometimes I keep birds for twopence a day, sir." "Well, then you shall take my horse home. You can't be worse off, my boy." As the captain made this determination, it had struck him that such a lad might be of service in the garden and about the grounds, and help an old servant that he intended to leave in his house till his return from the army. Captain Grey's establishment was but small. A woman about 50 who had lived in the family from a child was the only female, and easily and willingly took upon herself the various duties of housekeeper, cook, and so forth. Nor had she ever found the toil too great. The captain's situation had not permitted him to be much at home. Therefore, Mrs. Mary, the name by which she was known to the neighbourhood, had employed her leisure time in making all the linen that was used in the house, in pickling, preserving, potting, with the innumerable etceteras which a good housewife easily understands and as easily performs. The next in Captain Grey's domestic list was the gardener, the major domo, and commander-in-chief out of doors, an old grey-headed rustic, Abraham Wilkins by name, deeply versed in all the learning of the country, more particularly in divinity, astronomy, blended with a little astrology, law, politics, and physic. In the first, he was considered by all the parish as a match for the curate himself. In the second and its appurtenances, he stood without a rival, and gave forth the starry law to the amazement of his hearers. In the game law, ofttimes had a neighbouring squire been known to abide by his opinion, and even consult him on precedents and deeds of yore. In politics, he had confused and dumbfounded the exciseman, while his physical knowledge had excluded each apothecary from the place. The last of the family was Dick, a military valet, a wild, restless young fellow. He had at an early age been forced into the army, and had seen more service, had encountered more difficulties, dangers, and dilemmas than many professed veterans of twice his standing. Particular circumstances had attached him to Captain Grey, whose mild and benevolent manners alone assuaged his violent and unsettled frame. But as there will be occasion to introduce him in the subsequent part of this history, I waive any further description of him. As this last-mentioned servant was to accompany his master to the regiment, and the old gardener advanced in years became daily more feeble, the captain had concluded that the poor boy, kept at a little expense, might assist Abraham in his absence. Immediately then the new purchase was delivered to his care, but Captain Grey, meeting with some farmers' daughters of his acquaintance, and as the old saying was, always true with him, that when a lady's in the case, you know all other things give place. So it fared with him at present, who, what with going to the wild beasts and the shows and purchase of fairings, delayed his return till the evening. It was 7:30 before they set off. The new servant on the charger felt, for the first time in his life, a seeming consequence, and the captain, as he turned round his head to see how his attendant came on, could not help remarking to himself, in spite of the meagre look and tattered garb of the youth, that he was as comely a looking boy as he had ever beheld. The new horse had neither saddle nor bridle, which induced Captain Grey to ride very slow, and by the time he turned from the public road to the cross one, a little more than a mile to his house, it began to grow dusky. On each side of a narrow lane, the full-leaved trees overhanging almost touched at top and still increased the gloom. As he moved gently along and was about halfway down the lane, he heard a loud whistle from behind. The horse he rode at the same instant started, and directly 2 men leapt from the hedge and seized the bridle. A third, running down the lane, joined them, and with their pistols at his head and repeated oaths demanded his money. The captain did not demur, but produced his purse, which on account of his purchase was not of much value. His watch they seized on next, and still seemed unwilling to let him depart, which Captain Grey requiring, one of them exclaimed, "Yes, damn me, when I've blowed out your brains you'll duck pickpockets, will he? Damn me, I know you now," and instantly struck him on the head with the butt end of the pistol. The captain fell from his horse. The animal, frightened, instantly galloped away. The boy behind, who had been panic-struck at the commencement of the business, found all his blood return, and the appearance of his patron extended on the ground, the loss of the only friend he had ever experienced, drove away every idea of personal danger. With uplifted staff he urged his horse forward. But whither am I hasting? The occurrences of the evening surely deserve a chapter to themselves. Chapter 2. Epigraph. As when a lion on Numidian plains is compassed round by dogs and clamorous swains, he from his eyes defiance casts around, roars out, and proudly traverses the ground, demanding the generous combat, does invite the distant huntsman to a closer fight. They stand aloof and missive weapons throw, but none dare grapple with the noble foe. Blackmore's Eliza. Reader, if from the verge of misery thou hast ever found a benefactor that saved thee from destruction, thou mayst conceive the grateful ardour that animated the poor lad to the succour of his friend. With uplifted staff he urged his horse forward. The villains, who before had little regarded him, perceived his approach with the more indignation than alarm. Murder now was determined on, and they at once discharged their pistols. The balls whizzed around his head. The flash and report were the signals to the old warrior. His drooping ears roused at the well-known sound. He snorted for the fight, and, like the attracted lightning, flew to the spot. No longer dilatory and slow, he seconded every motion of his rider, and seemed endued with the same spirit. The charge was dreadful. Full upon the astonished trio the centaur rushed. In vain they avoided the double strokes, one flaying the pawing forefoot reached, while the breast of a second received the indignant spurn from behind, and in a twinkling 2 of the wretches fell victims by the side of the captain. The third, who was the principal, leapt over the ditch, and rushing through the hedge hastened with all his speed across the fields. The young hero gave himself no time for thought, but, regardless of every impediment, dashed over hedge and ditch and instantly followed. In vain the pursued twisted and turned his steps and endeavoured to intimidate horse and rider. The spirits of both, once roused, were not so easily to be appalled. Yet twice did the quickness of his motion escape the charge of the warriors, and twice in passing had he struck the youth upon the leg. Again, too, a third time he was avoiding the shock when Vengeance, who unwillingly saw so great a villain unpunished, alighted upon the top of the young hero's cudgel, and with more than common fury urged his weapon forward. It encountered the hand which held the brandished pistol, and struck it from the grasp, but stopped not there. That part of the note which the learned and unlearned unite in calling the bridge next felt its force. The shock was too great for simple nature to trust in. It shrunk back to its parent, the face, who in sorrow and affliction for the injury committed on its favourite hid itself in the dust. Victory, well pleased, now shook her silver pinions, and the conqueror, perceiving his last opponent without motion, hastened back to look for his patron and his friend. He soon returned to the lane, which was distant about 1/4 of a mile from the spot where he had overtaken the enemy. But what was his surprise when neither the captain or the 2 villains were to be seen? It was nearly dark. The field of combat was hid by the intervening hedges and the lateness of the evening. No words had passed between the combatants, or any noise save the galloping of a horse. Again and again did the youth traverse the lane. Repeatedly did he call. Not a human sound but his own voice was to be heard. Unaccustomed to the ways and manners of men, further than a common poorhouse can give, he was at a loss how to act, and even had he known, he was totally ignorant of the road and could not even form an opinion which way to turn his horse. The blows he had received upon his leg began to give him some pain, and he naturally wished to find someone of whom he might be able to inquire what he was to do. He dreaded the idea of going back to his opponent, who, whether dead or alive, he had no longer any wish to meet, and he feared the sight of every man, lest he should prove one of the gang. The dread of being called to account for what had lately happened also came into his mind, and 1,000 confused thoughts of what might befall him, parish officers, a justice, and a prison, followed one another, and nothing less than the gallows terminated the scene. At last he resolved to continue up the lane the way he was going with the captain, and trust to chance for what might afterwards befall him. He had not proceeded far from the lane when the distant tinkling of sheep bells struck his ears. It was the only music he had ever heard, and now was doubly grateful it seemed as the voice of a friend. Not the mariner when first he sees his native land, nor the wretched prisoner when he hears the tidings of his liberty, not the schoolboy when the holiday morn arrives, not the country lass when she enters the sacred church to be made an honest woman of, not the ancient sportsman when the invigorating tally-ho nerves his shrivelled frame. In short, nothing but my heart, my beloved, and first thou smile upon me, ever felt more pleasing sensation than those that at this moment charmed his little breast. It was the only sound that had not the voice of danger, and as he listened for a moment he forgot his master, his pains, and his dangers. Instantly he turned his horse towards the spot which lay across the downs, seemingly at a distance, and as fast as the pain in his leg permitted, which increased as he grew cold, hastened forward. He had arrived within sight of the fold when he perceived 2 men on horseback coming towards him. He wished, through natural agitation of mind, to have avoided them, which they, noticing, made up to him, and inquired who he was and where he was going. The strange account he gave did not seem to these gentlemen satisfactory, for in relating the robbery he had not mentioned the affray at the fair, and only said as he was following his master they were attacked, etc. The men were 2 farmers returning from the same fair, sufficiently in liquor to have the highest opinion of themselves, and to be wonderfully clear-sighted. As such, they immediately saw that the horse was stolen, and apprehended him, incapable and unwilling to resist, not considering the improbability that a poor boy, about 12 years of age, should at that time of night be wandering with a stolen horse across the downs. They determined, therefore, to take him home as a criminal for the night, intending next morning to go before the justice. What had fully satisfied these wiseacres, who were brothers, and prevented their returning him to the field where he left his last antagonist, was that he could not tell the name of his master, but said that he was taken by him from the fair, and did not know. The house was not above 4 miles distant. One, therefore, took hold of his horse's halter, and placing him between them, they were soon there. Having alighted, they conducted him in due form to the stable, and leaving him to the care of 2 labourers, went to tell their wondrous story to the females within. The house was quickly emptied to see this desperate felon, and not a female, to their credit be it spoken, that did not, at the first view, call the sapient takers by the deserved appellation of fools. "Ah, John, John," said their mother, for they lived with a mother and 3 sisters, "this is one of thy drunken fancies. Do let the poor boy go." "I don't know where to go," said John. "Says our master can't tell us his name. Takes him before Justice Wills tomorrow. Get a deal of money for it." "Oh, why didst thee, Tom," said the mother, "let thy brother do so? I thought thee hadst known better." "Why, mother," said Tom, "I've got a good stout horse, must have stolen him. Where should he get a horse?" "Don't you hear, brother?" said one of his sisters. "'Tis his master's." "I don't know his master's name," replied the clown. Now, we won't lose the money for taking him. And then, besides, may likely be we be raked over the coals for letting him go. Here, Tom and old Will shall fit up and guard him, and Bet, you get some beer and victuals, and Gee the boy some. I don't starve him, nither." So saying, the brethren went in, and the women, knowing it would be in vain to oppose them, began to get what information they could from the boy himself. In the course of which, perceiving him leaning against the wall and in much pain, being informed of the blows in his leg, they very humanely examined it. It was violently bruised, but as neither the bone was broken nor the skin rubbed off, a bandage dipped in vinegar and braced around it greatly took off from the pain. As his tale had every appearance of truth, and that it did not vary, they comforted him, with the hopes of being released in the morning, and hearing something of his master, and assured him for the present of a good supper and a comfortable bed of clean straw. The kind females made good their words, and our little hero, after a good meal, soon forgot all his cares in the arms of the obliterating deity. That's the end for today. We will continue tomorrow with part 2.